The village of Airwood lay nestled at the edge of a sprawling, ancient forest. Here, beneath the vast, brooding canopy of ancient oaks and birches, time seemed to stand still. The villagers, hardy folk who had eked out a simple existence for generations, knew better than to venture far into the woods. Stories of the forest's dark heart, its cursed center, were whispered at hearthsides on cold winter nights. Tales passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. Even the boldest hunters rarely strayed past the outermost edge, where shafts of sunlight still danced through the leaves. It was in this quiet village, in the shadow of that untamed wilderness, that two young men, Quinn and Lorne, found themselves at a crossroads in life. They were childhood friends, bound not just by shared memories, but by an insatiable yearning for adventure. Quinn, the son of a blacksmith, was broad-shouldered and possessed a spark of mischief in his green eyes. Lorne, the quieter of the two, had a wiry frame and an air of introspection that belied his sharp wit. Together, they had spent their youth exploring every nook and cranny of Airwood's outskirts, imagining themselves as legendary heroes of old. But now, as men on the cusp of adulthood, their imaginations had begun to drift towards something far more tangible: treasure. The spark that ignited their dream came in the form of a traveler's tale. One evening, as the village gathered in the common hall to escape the biting winds of early autumn, a grizzled wanderer shared his story. He claimed to have stumbled upon an ancient map, one that pointed to the location of a vast hoard of gold buried deep within the forest. The map was lost now, or so he said, but his words painted a vivid picture of untold riches lying dormant beneath the forest's mossy floor. Though many dismissed the tale as drunken rambling, Quinn and Lorne saw it as a sign. The two could speak of little else in the weeks that followed. Quinn, ever the optimist, was certain that the treasure was real, while Lorne's curiosity was piqued by the mystery of it all. They spent countless hours poring over scraps of old maps, piecing together what little they knew of the forest's geography. Lorne even consulted Elder Harold, the village's keeper of lore, under the guise of studying local history. Harold, a stern man with a snowy beard that reached his chest, warned him of the forest's dangers. "The forest guards its secrets jealously," Harold said, his voice low and gravelly. "Many have gone searching for its heart, and few have returned. Those who did were broken." His pale blue eyes, filled with the weight of years, bored into Lorne's. "Forget the stories. They will bring you nothing but sorrow." But Harold's warnings only added fuel to their fire. If the forest truly was cursed, then perhaps it was fear, not impossibility, that had kept the treasure hidden for so long. And if the risks were as great as Harold claimed, then surely the reward must be equally monumental. One crisp morning, the first frost of the season glittering on the grass, Quinn burst into Lorne's modest cottage, waving a tattered piece of parchment. "Look at this," he exclaimed, slamming the parchment onto the rickety wooden table. Lorne blinked the sleep from his eyes and leaned in for a closer look. The parchment was ancient, its edges frayed and yellowed with age, though much of the ink had faded. Faint lines and markings were still visible, forming what appeared to be a crude map. "Where did you get this?" Lorne asked, his voice tinged with awe. "From my father's old trunk," Quinn replied, grinning like a cat with cream. "He used it when he was a young man, chasing the same stories we are now. He never found anything, of course, but it's a start." The map was vague, offering no clear landmarks or directions, but at its center was a symbol, a circle surrounded by jagged lines that neither of them could decipher. To Quinn, it was a beacon, a signpost guiding them toward their destiny. To Lorne, it was a puzzle begging to be solved. Over the next several days, the duo prepared for their journey with the fervor of men possessed. They scrounged together what supplies they could: a pair of sturdy lanterns, a bundle of dried meat and bread, and a well-used hunting knife. Quinn fashioned a crude spear from a length of wood and an old iron blade, while Lorne carefully stitched a satchel to carry their provisions. Their preparations did not go unnoticed. As word of their plans spread through the village, they were met with a mix of incredulity and concern. The older villagers shook their heads and muttered about the folly of youth, While their peers laughed at their naivety, only Harold seemed genuinely troubled. "You're playing with forces you don't understand," he told them during a chance encounter in the marketplace. "There are worse things than wolves in that forest." Despite his warnings, Quinn and Lorne pressed on, their resolve unshaken. By the time the first snowflakes began to fall, they were ready. On the morning of their departure, the village was eerily quiet. A thick mist hung over the fields, blurring the line between earth and sky. Quinn and Lorne stood at the forest's edge, their breath visible in the cold air. Behind them, the village seemed impossibly small, its familiar shapes fading into the haze. Ahead of them lay the unknown. For a moment, doubt flickered in Lorne's mind. The stories he had heard as a boy, the ghostly apparitions, the cursed travelers, seemed suddenly real. But then he looked at Quinn, whose eyes burned with determination, and the doubt melted away. "Ready?" Quinn asked, his voice steady. Lorne nodded. "Let's find our fortune." And with that, they stepped into the forest, the ancient trees closing in around them like the walls of a cathedral. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the forest itself were aware of their presence. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional caw of a distant crow. They walked for hours, following the faint traces of a path long since reclaimed by nature. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the trees growing thicker and more gnarled. What little sunlight filtered through the canopy was pale and weak, casting ghostly shadows on the forest floor. By midday, they came upon a small clearing, its center dominated by a moss-covered boulder. Lorne studied the map, comparing the markings to their surroundings. Though it was impossible to be certain, he felt a strange sense of familiarity. "This might be it," he said, pointing to the map's central symbol, the heart of the forest. Quinn's grin widened. "Then we're on the right track." But as they rested and ate a meager lunch, a strange feeling began to creep over them. It was subtle at first, a tingling at the back of the neck, a sense of being watched. The forest, so silent and still when they arrived, seemed to stir. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it faint, almost human voices. Quinn was the first to notice the figure. It was fleeting, barely more than a shadow flitting between the trees at the edge of the clearing. But it was enough to set his heart racing. "Did you see that?" he whispered, clutching his spear. Lorne shook his head, but his eyes darted nervously around the clearing. "What did it look like?" "I don't know," Quinn admitted, "but it's not just us out here." As the day wore on, the sense of unease grew. The forest, once a place of mystery and wonder, had become oppressive, its silence deafening. Quinn and Lorne pressed on, driven by equal parts determination and fear. They did not know what awaited them in the heart of the forest, but they knew there was no turning back. The storm arrived suddenly, as it often did in the shadow of the ancient forest. Thunder growled in the distance, a low and ominous rumble that shook the air, while sheets of rain lashed against the thatched roofs of Airwood. Inside a small wooden house near the village's edge, Quinn and Lorne sat by the fire, the warm glow of the flames casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The day's journey into the forest had left them weary, and their conversation was subdued. Lorne was hunched over the tattered map, his brow furrowed as he traced its faint lines with a calloused finger, while Quinn sharpened his spear, the rhythmic scrape of stone on metal blending with the patter of rain. "Do you think it's real?" Lorne asked suddenly, his voice low. He didn't look up from the map, but his words hung in the air like a challenge. Quinn paused, the whetstone still in his hand. "Of course it's real," he replied, a hint of irritation creeping into his tone. Why would someone go to the trouble of making a map if there wasn't something worth finding? Lorne finally raised his head, his dark eyes searching Quinn's face. "And what about the stories? The things Elder Harold said?" Quinn scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. "Old tales to scare children. You know Harold. He sees danger in every shadow." Lorne said nothing, but his gaze lingered on Quinn for a moment longer before returning to the map. Outside, the storm intensified, the wind howling like a wounded animal. The shutters rattled in their frames, and for a moment, the fire guttered, casting the room into near darkness. Quinn added another log to the hearth, the flames roaring back to life as the wood caught. It was then that they heard the knock. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible beneath the roar of the storm. But as the two men sat frozen in silence, it came again, louder this time, urgent. Quinn and Lorne exchanged a glance, their earlier tension forgotten. No one would be out in weather like this unless it was an emergency. Grabbing his spear, Quinn moved cautiously toward the door, while Lorne fetched an oil lamp, the warm glow spilling across the floor as he lit it. Quinn unlatched the door and pulled it open just enough to peer outside. What he saw made him recoil. A man stood on the threshold, his figure illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his gaunt frame, and his face was pale as death. Blood seeped from a jagged wound in his side, staining his tunic and pooling at his feet. "Help me," the man rasped, his voice barely audible over the storm. Then, without warning, he collapsed. Quinn and Lorne acted quickly, dragging the stranger inside and laying him on the floor near the fire. Up close, he looked even worse. His face was hollow, his skin waxy, and his breathing shallow. Lorne fetched a blanket, draping it over the man's trembling form, while Quinn examined the wound. It was deep, a savage tear that could only have been made by claws or teeth. "Wolves?" Lorne asked, though his tone suggested he already doubted the answer. Quinn shook his head. "Too clean for wolves, and too large." The man stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They were glassy and unfocused, but there was a spark of desperation in them that made Quinn lean closer. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The man's lips moved, but no sound came out. Quinn reached for the water jug on the table, pouring a small amount into a tin cup and helping the man take a sip. The liquid seemed to revive him, if only briefly. "The forest," the man croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. It belongs to them." Quinn frowned. Who does it belong to?" The man's gaze sharpened, his eyes locking onto Quinn's with startling intensity. "The shadows," he said, his voice trembling. They watch. They wait. You mustn't go." His body convulsed suddenly, his back arching off the floor as a guttural cry escaped his lips. Lorne knelt beside him, trying to hold him still, but the man's strength was unnatural, his movements violent. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the seizure stopped. The man went still, his chest rising and falling once, twice, and then not at all. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the relentless hammering of rain on the roof. Lorne sat back on his heels, his hands shaking. "He's dead," he said, his voice barely audible. Quinn stared at the lifeless body, his mind racing. The man's final words echoed in his head, mingling with the tales he and Lorne had dismissed as superstition. He reached out and closed the man's eyes, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. It was then that he noticed the chain around the man's neck. Pulling the chain free, Quinn found a pendant hanging from it, a small, intricately carved disc of gold. The design was strange, unlike anything he had seen before, and as he held it up to the firelight, the lines seemed to shimmer and shift, as if alive. "What is it?" Lorne asked, his voice steadying. "I don't know," Quinn admitted, though he felt a strange unease as he looked at it. "But it's old, and valuable." Lorne frowned. "We should take it to Harold. He might know what it means." Quinn hesitated. The thought of handing over such a treasure, even temporarily, didn't sit well with him. But the man's death and his cryptic warnings had shaken him more than he cared to admit. "Fine," he said at last, "but we leave first thing in the morning." They barely slept that night, their thoughts consumed by the events of the evening. The storm passed just before dawn, leaving the world washed clean but eerily silent. As the first light of day crept over the horizon, Quinn and Lorne set out for Harold's house, the pendant safely tucked away in Quinn's satchel. The village was still waking when they arrived at the elder's home, a modest but well-kept cottage near the village square. Harold opened the door with a furrowed brow, his expression darkening further when he saw the grim look on the young men's faces. Without a word, he ushered them inside. As they recounted the night's events, Harold listened intently, his face growing more troubled with each passing word. When Quinn produced the pendant, the elder's hands trembled as he took it, his eyes widening in recognition. "Where did you get this?" Harold demanded, his voice sharp. Quinn explained, and when he finished, Harold let out a heavy sigh, sinking into his chair. "This is no ordinary trinket," he said, turning the pendant over in his hands. "It is a ward, an ancient talisman meant to protect its wearer from the dark forces that dwell in the forest." Lorne's stomach turned. Then why didn't it protect him? Harold's gaze was grave as he met Lorne's eyes. "Because some forces cannot be warded against. The man you found, he knew what he was dealing with, and he still could not escape. Whatever killed him will not stop with him." Quinn clenched his fists, his determination hardening. "Then we'll find it. We'll stop it." Harold shook his head. "You don't understand. This isn't a fight you can win. The forest is ancient, older than the village, older than the kingdom. There are things in its depths that defy reason, things that have slumbered for centuries but stir now because of your greed. Turn back before it's too late." But Harold's words fell on deaf ears. For Quinn and Lorne, the pendant was proof that the treasure was real and that it was worth the risk. Despite the elder's pleas, they left his cottage with renewed resolve, their minds set on continuing the journey they had begun. As they stepped into the cold morning air, a raven cawed from its perch atop the church steeple, its black wings beating against the pale sky. The forest loomed in the distance, dark and impenetrable, its secrets waiting to be uncovered. The chill of the morning lingered as Quinn and Lorne left Elder Harold's cottage. The weight of his warnings pressed on their minds, yet neither man spoke of turning back. The pendant hung heavy in Quinn's satchel, its intricate design a tantalizing reminder of the riches they believed lay within the forest. The storm from the night before had left the air sharp and clear, but it also seemed to have deepened the shadows of the forest, as if the trees themselves had drawn closer in the darkness. Their footsteps crunched on the frosted ground as they made their way to the village square. Though it was still early, several villagers had already gathered around the well, their voices low and anxious. News of the stranger's death had spread quickly, as news often did in Airwood. Whispers of omens and curses swirled through the air like smoke. "Did you hear? The man was found with a gold talisman around his neck," one woman murmured, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "They say he came from the forest, and the forest sent him back." "A warning, no doubt," an older man replied, shaking his head. "The forest doesn't take kindly to intruders." Quinn and Lorne avoided the crowd, their strides purposeful as they headed for Lorne's cottage to gather their supplies. Inside, the room was dim and cold, the ashes in the hearth long since burned out. Lorne went straight to the table where the map lay, his finger tracing the faded lines with a practiced ease. "We need to decide our route," he said, his voice steady despite the unease in his eyes. "If the pendant came from the treasure hoard, then the map might lead us to it. But if Harold's right—" Quinn cut him off. "Harold's wrong," he said firmly. "He's afraid of old stories. But we've already found something. This pendant proves that there's more out there. We can't stop now." Lorne hesitated, his brow furrowed. What if the stories are true? What if something's guarding the treasure? Quinn stepped closer, his green eyes bright with determination. "Then we'll face it, together." For a moment, Lorne said nothing, his gaze lingering on the map. Then he nodded, his resolve hardening. "All right, but we need to be careful." They spent the rest of the morning gathering what they would need for the journey. Their provisions were modest: dried meat, hard bread, and a flask of water each. Lorne added a coil of rope and a small tinderbox to his pack, while Quinn checked the edges of his hunting knife and spear. By midday, they were ready. The village was quieter now, the earlier gossip replaced by a heavy silence. As the two men passed the well, they felt the weight of the villagers' stares. Some looked at them with curiosity, others with fear, but no one spoke. It was as if the whole village was holding its breath, waiting to see whether they would return. At the edge of the forest, Elder Harold was waiting. The old man stood alone, his cloak drawn tightly around him against the cold. His pale blue eyes met Quinn's, And for a moment, neither man spoke. Then Harold stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on Quinn's arm. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly, his voice laced with an urgency that sent a shiver down Quinn's spine. "The forest doesn't forgive. If you go in there, you may never come out." Quinn's jaw tightened. "We've made our decision." Harold's gaze shifted to Lorne, who was standing a few paces behind. "And you? Do you truly understand the danger?" Lorne hesitated, his grip tightening on the strap of his pack. "I understand," he said finally, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "But we have to try." Harold sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of their stubbornness. "Then take this," he said, reaching into the folds of his cloak. He produced a small pouch tied with a thin leather cord and pressed it into Quinn's hand. "It's a ward, a charm against the dark forces that dwell in the forest. It may not be enough, but it's all I can give you." Quinn stared at the pouch for a moment before tucking it into his satchel alongside the pendant. "Thank you," he said, though his tone was more polite than grateful. Harold stepped back, his expression grim. "May the gods watch over you." Without another word, Quinn and Lorne turned and stepped into the forest. The shadows swallowed them whole, the dense canopy overhead blotting out the sun. The air grew colder, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant caw of a crow. They followed the faint path marked on the map, their progress slow but steady. The forest seemed to shift around them, the trees growing thicker and more twisted as they ventured deeper. What little light filtered through the branches was dim and gray, casting strange patterns on the ground. By late afternoon, they came upon a small stream, its water clear and icy cold. They stopped to drink, their breath misting in the chill air. As Lorne refilled his flask, he noticed something strange, a series of claw marks gouged into the bark of a nearby tree. The marks were deep and jagged, as if made by something far larger than a wolf. "Quinn," he called, his voice low. "Come look at this." Quinn joined him, his eyes narrowing as he examined the marks. "What do you think made them?" he asked. Lorne shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it was, it's big." Quinn straightened, his hand tightening on the shaft of his spear. "We need to keep moving. If there's something out here, I'd rather not wait for it to find us." They pressed on, the unease that had been simmering beneath the surface now bubbling closer to the surface. The forest grew darker as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the shadows lengthening and merging into a single, impenetrable blackness. As night fell, they found a small clearing and decided to make camp. Lorne built a fire, the flames providing a small circle of warmth and light in the oppressive darkness. Quinn kept watch, his spear close at hand, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. They ate in silence, the dried meat and bread doing little to satisfy their growing hunger. The forest was alive with sounds, branches creaking, leaves rustling, and the occasional distant howl. But beneath it all was a deeper, almost imperceptible hum, like the forest itself was breathing. Lorne was the first to break the silence. "Do you think Harold was right about the forest?" Quinn didn't answer immediately. He stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he said finally, "but we can't turn back now." Lorne nodded, though the knot of fear in his chest refused to loosen. "Then we'll have to be ready for whatever's out there." Quinn smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We will be." They took turns keeping watch, the hours dragging on as the forest seemed to close in around them. Quinn was on watch when he saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of the firelight. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest as he strained his eyes against the darkness. "Lorne," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Wake up." Lorne stirred, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at his side. "What is it?" Quinn pointed toward the trees, his grip tightening on his spear. "Something's out there." Lorne sat up, his eyes scanning the shadows. For a moment, there was nothing, just the flickering light of the fire and the endless, oppressive blackness. Then he saw it, a pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, watching them from the trees. They weren't alone. The glow of the eyes in the darkness was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but both Quinn and Lorne had seen it. They sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, their breaths shallow and their eyes locked on the edge of the firelight. The night was silent save for the faint crackle of the fire and the distant sigh of the wind through the trees. Whatever had been watching them had disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind an oppressive sense of unease. "Do you think it's still there?" Lorne whispered, his voice barely audible. Quinn's grip tightened on his spear. "I don't know, but it saw us. It knows we're here." They didn't sleep that night. The fire burned low, its flickering light casting strange, twisting shadows that seemed almost alive. The forest seemed to press in closer, the dark shapes of the trees looming like silent sentinels. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, set their nerves on edge. But morning came without incident, and when the first pale rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, they began to relax, if only slightly. Packing up camp was a quiet, hurried affair. Neither man spoke of what they had seen, but the memory lingered, unspoken and heavy in the air between them. As they resumed their journey deeper into the forest, they moved with greater caution, their senses sharp and their weapons always within reach. The forest changed as they traveled. The trees grew taller and thicker, their branches intertwining overhead to create a dense, shadowy ceiling. Moss covered the trunks in thick, damp layers, and the ground was littered with rotting leaves and fallen branches. The air was colder here, heavier, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. By midday, they came across an old hunting trail, its faint grooves barely visible beneath the undergrowth. It was a stroke of luck, and they followed it eagerly, their pace quickening as they hoped it would lead them closer to their destination. But as they walked, they began to notice strange markings carved into the trees, symbols that neither of them recognized. Some were simple lines and shapes, while others were intricate and almost beautiful in their complexity. "What do you think they mean?" Lorne asked, running his fingers over one of the carvings. Quinn frowned, his unease growing. Maybe they're just marks left by hunters, or maybe there's something else. Lorne didn't press the matter, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the symbols were watching him. They're strange, twisting lines seeming to shift and writhe whenever he looked away. The trail eventually led them to a clearing, where they decided to stop and eat. The clearing was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the grass. As they sat, Quinn pulled the pendant from his satchel, its golden surface catching the weak light. He turned it over in his hands, studying its intricate design. "It must be worth a fortune," he said, his voice tinged with wonder. "Maybe," Lorne replied, his eyes flicking to the pendant. "But what if it's more than just gold?" Harold said it was a ward, something to protect its owner. Quinn shrugged. "Harold says a lot of things. Maybe he's right. Maybe he's wrong. Either way, it's ours now." Lorne didn't respond, but his unease deepened. The pendant seemed to pulse faintly in the light, as if it were alive, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching them, just like the symbols on the trees. They continued their journey after a brief rest, their path taking them ever deeper into the heart of the forest. The air grew colder as the afternoon wore on, and a thin layer of frost began to coat the leaves and grass. By the time they stopped to make camp for the night, their breath was visible in the air, and their fingers were numb with cold. This time, they chose their campsite with greater care, finding a sheltered spot beneath the overhang of a rocky hill. Lorne built a fire while Quinn set up a crude perimeter using sticks and twine, hoping it would at least give them some warning if anything or anyone approached. The glow of the fire was a welcome relief from the encroaching darkness, but it did little to dispel the oppressive weight of the forest. As they ate their meager rations, they spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely louder than the crackle of the fire. "Do you think anyone else has ever made it this far?" Lorne asked, breaking the silence. "Maybe," Quinn replied, staring into the flames. "But if they did, they probably didn't come back. That's why the treasure's still here." Lorne nodded, though the thought brought him little comfort. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, its secrets hidden beneath layers of shadow and silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the forest itself was alive and aware of their presence. That night, they took turns keeping watch again. Lorne was on watch when he heard it, a faint sound, like the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. He froze, his hand tightening on his knife as he strained his ears. The sound came again, closer this time. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Quinn," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Wake up." Quinn stirred, his eyes snapping open. "What is it?" "Listen." They both sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the sound came again, a soft, deliberate crunch, followed by another. It was slow, measured, as if whatever was out there was circling them. Quinn grabbed his spear, his grip white-knuckled. "Stay close to the fire," he said, his voice low and steady. "Don't move." The sounds grew louder, closer, until they seemed to come from every direction. The forest was alive with movement, the shadows shifting and writhing like living things. And then, suddenly, they stopped. The silence was deafening, the air thick with tension. Quinn and Lorne sat frozen, their weapons ready, their eyes scanning the darkness. But nothing happened. The shadows remained still, the forest silent. Hours passed before they finally allowed themselves to relax, though neither of them slept for the rest of the night. When morning came, the forest was unchanged, as if the night's events had been nothing more than a bad dream. But the unease lingered, and as they packed up camp, they both felt the weight of unseen eyes watching them. The journey continued, the forest growing colder and darker with each passing day. They saw no signs of other travelers, no traces of human life beyond the strange symbols on the trees. But the feeling of being watched never left them, and at night, the sounds returned, soft, deliberate, and unrelenting. Their supplies began to dwindle, and the cold became more biting, sapping their strength and resolve. But the pendant was a constant reminder of why they were there, its golden surface gleaming like a promise of wealth and glory. Quinn's determination never wavered, but Lorne began to feel the weight of doubt pressing down on him. The forest was vast and unyielding, its secrets buried beneath layers of shadow and frost. And whatever was out there, watching them, was growing bolder. As they pushed deeper into the wilderness, they began to notice more signs of something unnatural. The trees grew twisted and blackened, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the ground was littered with bones, some animal, some human. The pendant grew warmer as they traveled, its faint pulse a constant presence in Quinn's satchel. It seemed to guide them, its golden surface glowing faintly in the dim light. But with each step, the unease grew, the weight of the forest pressing down on them like a living thing. And then, one evening, as the last light of day faded from the sky, they saw it, a faint, flickering glow in the distance, like the light of a fire. It was small, barely visible through the dense trees, but it was enough to set their hearts racing. "Do you think it's someone else?" Lorne asked, his voice trembling. Quinn's grip tightened on his spear. Only one way to find out. They moved cautiously toward the light, their steps slow and deliberate. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they approached, the air thick with anticipation. And as they drew closer, the glow grew brighter, revealing the faint outline of a figure sitting by the fire. It was an old man, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood, and beside him sat a boy no older than 10, his wide eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. The boy turned to look at them as they approached, his gaze piercing and unblinking. "Welcome, travelers," the old man said, his voice low and gravelly. "You've come far, but your journey is only just beginning." The light from the hermit's fire seemed feeble against the encroaching darkness, yet it was the only beacon in the void of the forest. The old man, wrapped in a cloak so worn it might have been older than the village of Airwood itself, sat cross-legged near the flames, his hands resting on his knees. Beside him sat the child, a boy no older than 10, his pale face framed by unkempt black hair. The boy's eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, their intensity far beyond his years. Quinn and Lorne approached cautiously, their weapons still drawn. The sight of the strange duo unsettled them, but curiosity and the faint glimmer of trust inspired by the fire drew them closer. "Sit," the hermit said, his voice rasping like wind through dead leaves. "You've walked far, and the forest doesn't forgive haste." Quinn hesitated, his grip tightening on his spear. "Who are you? Why are you out here?" The hermit didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a stick and poked at the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. The boy remained silent, his unblinking gaze fixed on the two travelers. At last, the old man spoke. "My name doesn't matter," he said. "Names hold little meaning in a place like this. You may call me whatever you wish. As for why I am here," he gestured vaguely toward the forest, his hand trembling slightly. "I am here because I must be." "That's not an answer," Quinn said, his tone sharp. "What do you mean? You must be?" The hermit smiled faintly, the expression barely lifting the corners of his mouth. "The forest calls to everyone in its own way," he said. "Some come seeking fortune, like yourselves. Others come seeking answers. And a few," his voice trailed off, and his gaze shifted toward the boy. "A few are chosen." The boy turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Lorne's. There was something unnerving about his stare, an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through him. Lorne felt an involuntary shiver run down his spine. "Chosen for what?" Lorne asked, his voice quieter than he intended. "To see," the hermit replied. "To understand. To carry the burden of knowing." Quinn let out a frustrated sigh. "Enough riddles. If you know something about the treasure, tell us. Otherwise, we'll be on our way." The hermit's gaze shifted to Quinn, and for a moment, the firelight reflected in his eyes seemed to dim. "The treasure," he said slowly, as if tasting the word. "You think you're chasing gold, riches, something tangible you can hold in your hands. But you are mistaken." Quinn crossed his arms, his frustration mounting. "Then what are we chasing?" The hermit leaned forward slightly, the shadows of his hood falling away to reveal a face lined with age and sorrow. "A curse," he said, "a prison. The heart of the forest is not a place of riches. It is a place of ruin." For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Quinn stared at the hermit, his jaw clenched. "You're just like the others," he said. "The villagers, Harold, even that man who died on our doorstep. All of you are afraid of shadows and stories." The hermit didn't react to Quinn's outburst. Instead, he turned to Lorne. "And you?" he asked. "Do you feel it yet? The weight of the forest?" Lorne hesitated. The truth was, he did feel it, a sense of unease that had been growing ever since they first stepped beneath the canopy. But he wasn't ready to admit it. "We've made it this far," he said. "We can handle whatever's out there." The hermit sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "I have heard those words before," he said, "many times, and I have seen what becomes of those who speak them." He gestured to the boy, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "This is Merrick," the hermit said. "He has a gift, or a curse, depending on how you see it. When he touches the dead, he sees their past, their final moments. He knows what happened to the man you found." Quinn and Lorne exchanged a glance. The mention of the dead man, and the pendant they had taken from him, brought back the memories of that stormy night. The boy, Merrick, stood slowly and stepped toward them, his movements unnervingly fluid for a child. He held out his hand. "Let me see it," he said, his voice soft but commanding. Quinn frowned. "See what?" "The pendant," Merrick replied. "It will show me what he saw." Lorne looked at Quinn, his expression uncertain. After a moment's hesitation, Quinn reached into his satchel and pulled out the pendant. He held it out to the boy, who took it carefully, his small hands trembling slightly as he closed them around the gold disc. Marek's eyes widened, and his body went rigid. His lips parted as if he were about to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, his breathing grew shallow, and his eyes glazed over, as if he were staring at something far away. The fire dimmed, its light flickering erratically. The shadows around the clearing deepened, and the air grew colder. Lorne felt his skin prickle with goosebumps, and he took an involuntary step back. "Merrick," the hermit said quietly, "what do you see?" The boy's voice, When it came, was strange and hollow, as if it were coming from somewhere deep within him. Darkness, he said, a forest without end, shadows moving in the trees. Watching, Lorne felt his heart race, and he exchanged a nervous glance with Quinn. Merrick continued, his voice growing fainter. He was running, the boy said, running from something he couldn't see. It was all around him, closing in. He thought he was safe, but it was already inside him. What does that mean? Quinn demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. Inside him? Merrick didn't answer. His hands trembled violently, and the pendant fell to the ground with a soft thud. The boy collapsed to his knees, his body shaking as if he were freezing. The hermit rushed to his side, wrapping an arm around him and whispering soothing words. After a moment, Marek's trembling subsided, and he looked up at the hermit with wide, tear-filled eyes. "It's awake," he whispered. "The forest. It's awake." The hermit closed his eyes, his expression one of deep sorrow. "I feared as much," he said. "What's awake?" Lorne asked, his voice rising. "What are you talking about?" The hermit looked at him, his gaze heavy with meaning. "The forest is not just trees and earth," he said. "It is alive, and it does not tolerate intruders." Quinn shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "This is madness," he said. "You're just trying to scare us. The treasure is real, and we're going to find it." The hermit sighed again, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stood slowly, helping Merrick to his feet. "I will not stop you," he said, "but I will warn you one last time. The heart of the forest is not a place of wealth. It is a place of despair, and once you enter, there is no turning back." With that, he turned and began to walk away, Merrick clinging to his side. The firelight cast their shadows long and thin against the trees, and within moments, they were swallowed by the darkness. Quinn and Lorne stood in silence, the weight of the encounter pressing down on them. The pendant lay on the ground between them, its golden surface gleaming faintly in the firelight. "What do we do now?" Lorne asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Quinn picked up the pendant and tucked it back into his satchel. "We keep going," he said firmly. "The treasure is out there, and we're not going to let a madman and his ghost-seeing boy scare us off." Lorne nodded reluctantly, though the unease in his chest only grew. As they extinguished the fire and prepared to move on, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows of the forest seemed to press closer, and the faint whisper of the wind carried an almost human note. The journey ahead felt heavier now, the path darker and more treacherous. But there was no turning back. The forest had claimed them, and whatever awaited at its heart, they were bound to face it. The forest was unervingly quiet as Quinn and Lorne left the clearing where the hermit and the strange boy had spoken their cryptic warnings. The air felt thicker now, every breath tinged with the damp, earthy scent of decay. The pendant in Quinn's satchel seemed to grow heavier with each step, as though it resented being carried further into the forest's depths. Neither man spoke for hours, their silence born of an unspoken agreement. Whatever they had seen and heard, it was best not to dwell on it. The forest, it seemed, had a way of twisting thoughts, feeding on fear and doubt. By midday, the trees had grown so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground, leaving the forest in a perpetual twilight. Lorne stopped suddenly, his hand rising to signal Quinn. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Quinn strained his ears, but heard nothing beyond the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly," Lorne replied. "No birds, no insects, it's too quiet." Quinn shrugged off the unease. "We've already seen strange things in this forest. A bit of quiet isn't going to scare me." Lorne frowned but said nothing. They pressed on, their path marked only by the faint guidance of the map and the occasional glimmer of the pendant. Yet, as they moved deeper, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and the trees themselves seemed to twist and lean, as if straining to listen to their whispers. The first real sign of danger came as the light began to fade. A soft, almost imperceptible sound reached Lorne's ears, a distant whisper, too faint to make out the words. He stopped, turning his head toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" he asked. his voice tight. Quinn shook his head. "You're imagining things." But Lorne wasn't so sure. The whispering grew louder as they continued, rising and falling like the rustle of wind through leaves. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, its source elusive. As night fell, they stopped to make camp, their fire a meager circle of light against the oppressive darkness. The whispering continued, now interspersed with faint, far-off laughter, soft and childlike, but warped and hollow. Lorne's skin crawled, but Quinn dismissed it. "It's just the wind," Quinn said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Nothing we haven't heard before." But as the firelight danced across the clearing, something changed. A figure appeared at the edge of the light, a young woman, her white dress glowing faintly in the dark. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands, and her head was bowed, obscuring her face. "Who's there?" Quinn demanded, rising to his feet and gripping his spear. The woman didn't move. She stood utterly still, like a statue carved from moonlight. Lorne's mouth went dry as he reached for his knife. "Quinn, something's not right." Quinn stepped closer, his spear raised. "Show yourself," he barked. The woman slowly lifted her head, revealing eyes that were empty voids of blackness. Her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, far too wide, as though her face were being stretched by unseen hands. The laughter they had heard earlier filled the air, now louder and sharper, echoing from every direction. Quinn froze, his confidence faltering. "Stay back," he warned, though his voice trembled. The woman tilted her head, the grin never fading. Then, in a sudden burst of motion, she lunged forward, her form dissolving into a cloud of shadow and mist that swirled around the clearing. The laughter grew deafening, joined by whispers that clawed at their sanity. "Run," Lorne shouted, grabbing Quinn's arm and pulling him away from the fire. They fled into the darkness, the forest a blur of shadows and twisted branches. The whispers and laughter pursued them, an invisible tide of malice that seemed to close in from all sides. Their flight was frantic and directionless, driven by fear and instinct. Roots and underbrush snagged at their feet, and low-hanging branches tore at their skin. The whispering grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices that seemed to speak directly into their minds. "Why are you here? You don't belong. Turn back or pay the price." Finally, they burst into a small clearing, their breaths ragged and their bodies trembling. The whispers faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Lorne collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest. What was that?" Quinn leaned against a tree, his knuckles white as he gripped his spear. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice hollow, but it wasn't real. It couldn't have been. Lorne shook his head. It felt real, too real. The pendant in Quinn's satchel pulsed faintly, its golden surface warm against his side. He pulled it out, holding it up to the faint light of the moon. The intricate carvings seemed to shift and writhe, their patterns growing more chaotic. "This thing," Quinn muttered. "It's connected to whatever's happening. It has to be." Lorne stared at the pendant, a sense of dread washing over him. "We should get rid of it. Leave it here." "No," Quinn said firmly, tucking it back into his satchel. "If it's connected to the treasure, we'll need it to find our way. We're too close to turn back now." Lorne didn't argue, but his unease only grew. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees leaning closer as if to listen to their every word. Sleep was impossible that night. The laughter and whispers returned, though more distant now, like a predator circling its prey. The next morning, the forest was eerily still. A thick fog had settled over the ground, shrouding everything in a cold, wet haze. They continued their journey, moving cautiously and speaking little. The encounter with the ghostly woman had shaken them both, though neither admitted it aloud. As the day wore on, they began to notice more signs of the forest's unnatural presence. Shadows moved at the edges of their vision, always just out of reach. Trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their gnarled branches forming skeletal figures that seemed to reach for them. And always, the faint whispers lingered, like a distant echo of their own thoughts. By late afternoon, they stumbled upon the remains of a campsite. The fire pit was cold and overgrown with moss, and a few scattered belongings lay half-buried in the dirt: a rusted knife, a torn satchel, and a tattered journal. Lorne picked up the journal, its leather cover cracked and stained. He opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age. The handwriting was frantic and uneven, the words scrawled in a chaotic jumble. "The shadows are alive. They watch us. They know. We thought we could find it. We thought we could take it. But it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the forest. I can't leave. It won't let me." Lorne closed the journal, his hands trembling. "Quinn," he said, his voice unsteady, "we're not the first ones to come here." Quinn looked at the journal, then at the rusted knife and torn satchel. What happened to them? Lorne didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was all around them, in the twisted trees, the whispers in the air, and the oppressive weight of the forest itself. As they pressed on, the forest grew darker, the fog thicker, the ground became treacherous, with hidden roots and patches of mud that threatened to swallow their boots. They moved slower now, their senses on high alert. Then, as night began to fall, they heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. It came from somewhere ahead, deep within the shadows. Quinn raised his spear, his heart pounding. "What was that?" Lorne whispered. Quinn didn't answer. He stepped forward cautiously, his grip on the spear tightening. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. The thing that emerged from the shadows was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was massive, its body a grotesque fusion of fur, bone, and shadow. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth was filled with jagged, yellowed teeth. Quinn and Lorne froze, their terror paralyzing them. The creature snarled, its massive form blocking their path. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a deafening roar, the creature lunged. Quinn reacted instinctively, thrusting his spear forward. The weapon struck the creature's side, but did little to stop its advance. It swiped at him with a massive claw, sending him sprawling to the ground. Lorne drew his knife and slashed at the creature's flank, but it barely flinched. The fight was desperate and chaotic, their weapons little match for the creature's raw power. But as the pendant pulsed in Quinn's satchel, the creature hesitated, its glowing eyes flicking toward the golden disc. Seeing an opportunity, Quinn grabbed the pendant and held it aloft. The creature roared, its body writhing as if in pain. The light from the pendant grew brighter, and the shadows around the creature seemed to dissolve. "Lorne, now!" Quinn shouted. Lorne drove his knife into the creature's exposed neck, and it let out a final, ear-splitting roar before collapsing to the ground. The forest fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. Quinn and Lorne stood over the creature's lifeless body, their breaths ragged and their hands trembling. The pendant's light dimmed, its surface once again cool and inert. "What the hell was that?" Lorne asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Quinn replied, his gaze fixed on the pendant. "But whatever it was, it's not the last." The forest loomed around them, silent and watching. They had survived the first trial, but the heart of the forest and the horrors it held still awaited. The forest opened reluctantly to reveal the looming presence of a jagged cliffside, its craggy surface blanketed with moss and dripping with years of accumulated rainwater. At its base, partially obscured by creeping vines and overhanging roots, yawned a dark, ominous cavern. The entrance seemed to breathe. Cold air poured out in waves, bringing with it the faint scent of decay and damp earth. The wind carried distant echoes, guttural and haunting, that sent chills down Quinn and Lorne's spines. "This is it," Quinn said, his voice strained from exertion and a growing sense of dread. He clutched the pendant tightly in his fist, its faint warmth reassuring despite the malevolent aura radiating from the cave. Lorne hesitated, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The clearing around the cavern felt unnatural, its silence suffocating. Even the ever-present whispers of the forest had gone still, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. "I don't like this," he muttered. "It feels wrong." Quinn shot him a sharp look. "You think I don't know that? We've come too far to turn back now." He stepped closer to the cavern, his boots sinking into the damp, soft earth. The treasure is in there. It has to be. Lorne reluctantly followed, his grip tightening on the hilt of his knife. As they approached, the temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew heavier, as though the cavern were exhaling its malice into the world. The pendant in Quinn's hand began to pulse faintly, its carvings glowing with a soft, golden light that illuminated the entrance. "I'll go first," Quinn said, his voice steadier than he felt. He gripped his spear tightly and stepped into the cavern, the faint glow of the pendant casting eerie shadows on the walls. Lorne followed close behind, his knife ready and his heart pounding. The interior of the cavern was a labyrinth of jagged rocks and narrow passageways, each step accompanied by the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The faint glow of the pendant provided just enough light to reveal the twisted patterns carved into the walls, ancient symbols and depictions of grotesque figures, their eyes hollow and mouths open in silent screams. "These carvings," Lorne whispered, his voice barely audible over the echoes of their movements. "They're warnings." Quinn glanced at one of the carvings, his jaw tightening. The figures depicted in the stone seemed almost alive, their twisted forms writhing in torment as though trying to escape their stony prison. "Maybe they're warnings," he said, "or maybe they're just stories. Either way, they don't change anything." The passage narrowed, forcing them to move single file. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of whispers returned, echoing faintly off the walls. Lorne's skin prickled as the voices grew louder, though he still couldn't make out the words. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking. Quinn nodded grimly. "Ignore it. They're just trying to scare us." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until they became an overwhelming chorus of voices, each one layered over the other. "Turn back. Leave this place. You do not belong." Lorne pressed his hands to his ears, but the voices seemed to echo inside his mind. "Quinn, we need to go. This place isn't natural." Quinn turned to face him, his eyes blazing with determination. "We're not leaving. Not after everything we've been through." As if in response to his defiance, the whispers abruptly stopped, leaving behind a silence so profound it was almost deafening. Then, from the depths of the cavern, came a low, guttural growl. Lorne froze, his knife trembling in his grip. What was that? Quinn didn't answer. He tightened his grip on his spear and stepped forward, the glow of the pendant illuminating the path ahead. The growl came again, louder this time, reverberating through the stone walls. As they rounded a bend in the passageway, the cavern opened into a vast chamber. The ceiling stretched high above them, disappearing into darkness, while the floor was littered with bones, human and animal alike. At the center of the chamber stood an ancient altar, its surface stained dark with centuries of blood. Behind it loomed a massive, jagged crack in the wall, pulsating with a faint, otherworldly light. Quinn's breath caught in his throat. This has to be it. The heart of the forest. Lorne's eyes were fixed on the crack in the wall. "I don't think this is a treasure hoard," he said, his voice trembling. "This is something else. Something worse." Quinn stepped closer to the altar, his eyes scanning its surface. The pendant pulsed in his hand, its glow intensifying as he approached. He set it on the altar, the light spilling over the carvings etched into the stone. They depicted a battle, figures wielding weapons against a massive, shadowy beast with glowing eyes. "This altar," Quinn said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a seal." "A seal?" Lorne asked, his gaze darting nervously around the chamber. "A seal for what?" Before Quinn could answer, the growl came again, this time so loud and guttural that the ground beneath their feet trembled. The crack in the wall began to widen, the faint light spilling out into the chamber. And then they saw it. The beast that emerged from the crack was unlike anything they had ever imagined. Its body was a shifting mass of shadow and sinew, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. It stood on 4 massive legs, each one ending in claws that seemed to cut through the air itself. Its mouth opened to reveal rows of jagged teeth, and from its throat came a sound that was equal parts growl and scream. Quinn and Lorne stood frozen, their weapons useless in the face of such a monstrosity. The creature stepped forward, its movements fluid and predatory, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "You are not welcome. You will not leave." Lorne stumbled backward, his knife slipping from his hand. "Quinn, we have to run. We can't fight this." Quinn's gaze flicked to the pendant on the altar. Its light had grown so bright that it hurt to look at, and the carvings on its surface seemed to twist and writhe. "The pendant," he said. "It's the key. It's holding this thing back." The beast lunged toward them, its massive claws slashing through the air. Quinn grabbed the pendant and held it up, its light flaring brightly. The beast recoiled with a deafening roar, its body writhing as if in pain. "Keep it back," Lorne shouted, scrambling to his feet. Quinn stepped forward, the light from the pendant pushing the beast back toward the crack in the wall. "We need to seal it," he said through gritted teeth. "The altar. It's the only way." Lorne ran to the altar, his hands trembling as he traced the carvings. "How? What do we do?" The whispers grew louder, their voices merging into a single, commanding tone. "The blood of the living seals the darkness." Quinn's eyes widened as the meaning of the words sank in. "No," he said. "There has to be another way." The beast roared again, its massive form thrashing against the light of the pendant. The chamber shook, and cracks began to spiderweb across the walls and floor. "There's no time," Lorne shouted. "What do we do?" Quinn looked at the pendant, its light growing fainter with each passing second. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll finish this." "What are you talking about?" Lorne demanded, panic rising in his voice. Quinn turned to face him, his expression calm despite the chaos around them. "It needs blood, a sacrifice. If this thing gets out, it'll destroy everything. Someone has to stop it." "No," Lorne said, shaking his head. "There has to be another way. We can." "There's no time," Quinn said firmly. He placed the pendant back on the altar, its light flaring brightly one last time. "Take it back to the village. Make sure they never come here again." Before Lorne could protest, Quinn slashed his palm with his knife and pressed his bloodied hand against the altar. The carvings glowed with a fiery light, and the beast let out a final, ear-splitting roar as it was pulled back into the crack. The light from the altar consumed the chamber, and Lorne was thrown backward, the force of the energy overwhelming him. When he opened his eyes, the cavern was silent. The beast was gone, the altar cold and dark, and Quinn was nowhere to be seen. Lorne collapsed to his knees, his body trembling as tears streamed down his face. The whispers were gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. He clutched the pendant, its light dim and lifeless, and stumbled out of the cavern, the weight of Quinn's sacrifice heavy on his soul. The forest watched him as he left, its shadows retreating but never fully disappearing. The heart of the forest was sealed once more, but the cost had been greater than he could bear. The forest loomed around Lorne as he stumbled through its endless shadows, the pendant clutched tightly in his trembling hands. The weight of the artifact was unbearable, not for its physical mass, but for what it symbolized. Each pulse of its faint, golden light felt like a heartbeat, a reminder of Quinn's sacrifice and the horrors they had faced within the cavern. The oppressive silence of the forest was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Though no wind stirred, every shadow seemed alive, every tree a sentinel watching his fragile steps. The forest did not mourn Quinn. It remained as it always was, unyielding, ancient, and indifferent to the lives it consumed. But Lorne mourned. Each step he took away from the cavern felt like a betrayal. He could still see Quinn's determined face in his mind's eye, the finality in his voice as he said, "Make sure they never come here again." His words were a mantra now, repeating over and over in Lorne's thoughts as he fought his way through the forest. He didn't know how much time had passed since he'd escaped the cavern. The sun remained hidden behind a canopy of gnarled branches, and the dim light that filtered through was indistinguishable from dawn or dusk. His body was exhausted, his muscles burning with each step, but he couldn't stop. Stopping meant succumbing to the forest, to despair, to the whispers that still lingered at the edges of his consciousness. The pendant grew warmer in his hand, its pulsing light quickening like a warning. Lorne froze, his breath catching in his throat. The forest was no longer silent. Somewhere behind him, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, the crunch of leaves underfoot growing louder with each step. Lorne turned, his knife shaking in his grip, but there was nothing to be seen, only trees and shadows. "Quinn," he whispered, though he knew it couldn't be. The footsteps stopped. A cold, hollow laugh echoed through the forest, sending chills down Lorne's spine. It wasn't Quinn. It wasn't anything human. The laughter grew louder, joined by whispers, familiar yet incomprehensible, like a voice speaking directly into his mind. Lorne's grip on the pendant tightened, its warmth spreading through his palm. He began to run, his breaths ragged and uneven as he darted between the trees. The laughter and whispers followed, growing louder and more chaotic, until they seemed to come from every direction. "You cannot escape," the voices taunted. "You cannot leave." The pendant's light flared suddenly, blinding in its intensity, and the laughter stopped. The forest fell silent once more, though the oppressive weight of its presence remained. Lorne leaned against a tree, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. He stared at the pendant, its glow fading back to a faint pulse. It had saved him, just as it had held the beast at bay in the cavern. But for how long? The journey back to the village felt endless. The forest seemed to shift around him, its paths twisting and merging in ways that defied logic. More than once, Lorne found himself doubling back, his own footprints in the damp earth mocking his sense of direction. The whispers returned sporadically, faint and teasing, but the laughter did not. By the time he emerged from the forest's edge, his body was on the verge of collapse. The sight of Airwood's familiar rooftops brought tears to his eyes. Though the village seemed smaller now, almost insignificant in the shadow of the forest. The villagers gathered quickly when they saw him stumble into the square, his clothes torn and his face pale. Their murmurs rose like the buzz of a restless hive, filled with questions and accusations. "Where's Quinn?" someone asked. "What happened to you?" another demanded. Lorne didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of their questions pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. Elder Harold pushed through the crowd, his weathered face grim as he studied Lorne's trembling form. "Come," Harold said, his voice low but commanding. "We'll speak inside." Inside Harold's cottage, the fire crackled softly, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that clung to Lorne's skin. He sat hunched over in a wooden chair, the pendant resting on the table between them. Harold stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "This," Harold said finally, his voice tinged with both reverence and fear, "is what called you into the forest, isn't it?" Lorne nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He reached for the mug of water Harold had placed before him, his hands shaking as he drank. "And Quinn?" Harold pressed gently. Lorne closed his eyes, the memories flooding back with brutal clarity. He didn't make it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He sacrificed himself to seal something." Harold's expression darkened. "The beast." Lorne's eyes snapped open. "You knew?" The elder nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the pendant. "I suspected. The stories of the forest have always warned of a great evil, bound by ancient magic. This pendant, it is both a key and a lock. It binds the darkness, but it also calls to it. That is why it must never leave the forest." Lorne's grip on the mug tightened. "Then why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us go?" Harold's shoulders slumped, the weight of his years evident in the gesture. "Would you have listened? You were both so determined, so blinded by the promise of treasure." He sighed. "I hoped. I prayed that you would turn back. But the forest has a way of claiming those who enter it." Lorne felt a surge of anger rise within him, though it was quickly replaced by exhaustion. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the pendant's faint glow. Quinn gave his life to stop that thing. And for what? The forest is still there. The whispers, the shadows, they're still waiting. Harold reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on the pendant. "The forest will always wait," he said. "It is ancient. older than the village, older than the kingdom. But for now, the seal holds. Quinn's sacrifice ensured that. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Lorne's eyes burned with unshed tears as he thought of his friend, of the life they had dreamed of beyond the forest, a life that would never come to pass. In the days that followed, Lorne struggled to reintegrate into the rhythm of village life. The whispers of the forest no longer haunted his dreams, but the memories of what he had seen and lost lingered like a shadow. The villagers treated him with a mix of awe and suspicion, their curiosity tempered by the fear of what he might have brought back with him. The pendant remained with Harold, locked away in a small chest reinforced with iron and carved with protective symbols. "It must stay here," Harold had said. "The forest will call for it again, but we cannot let it answer." Lorne spent his days in solitude, tending to small tasks and avoiding the questions of curious villagers. He visited Quinn's family, offering them what little comfort he could, though the guilt of his survival weighed heavily on him. As the seasons changed, the forest grew quiet once more, its shadows retreating to the edges of the village's collective memory. But Lorne could never forget. Each time he passed the forest's edge, he felt its presence, a subtle, watching stillness that reminded him of the price they had paid. Years later, when the snow began to fall thick and heavy over Airwood, Lorne found himself drawn to the forest once more. He stood at its edge, his breath visible in the frigid air, and stared into the shadows that had once consumed him. "Quinn," he whispered, his voice carried away by the wind. "I hope it was worth it." The forest gave no answer. It never would. But as Lorne turned to walk away, he thought he heard, faint and distant, the sound of a voice, soft and familiar, like an echo of a memory. "Take care of them, Lorne." He paused, his chest tightening, and glanced back at the forest. The shadows seemed less oppressive now, though they still loomed. Perhaps they always would. But for the first time in years, Lorne felt a glimmer of peace. He nodded to the trees, a silent promise, and walked back toward the village, the snow falling gently around him. The winter in Airwood was harsh, the snow piling high against the wooden walls of the cottages. The forest stood still, cloaked in frost, its towering trees casting long shadows across the frozen ground. For most of the villagers, the season brought peace, a time to gather around warm hearths and share stories of the past. But for Lorne, the winter offered no such comfort. The shadows of the forest lingered in his thoughts, haunting him in the stillness of the night. Quinn's sacrifice, the beast in the cavern, and the whispers of the forest were etched into his memory, refusing to fade. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the jagged crack in the stone wall, glowing faintly as the beast emerged from the abyss. Lorne worked tirelessly during the day, chopping wood and tending to small repairs around the village. But the physical labor did little to silence the storm inside his mind. The villagers kept their distance, unsure of how to approach him. His survival had become a legend, whispered about in corners, but no one dared to ask him for the details of what had happened. One frigid morning, as he worked in the clearing near the edge of the forest, Lorne heard the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow. He turned to see Elder Harold approaching, wrapped in a thick woolen cloak. The elder's face was grave, his pale blue eyes sharper than usual. "I've come to speak with you," Harold said, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. Lorne set down his axe and gestured toward a nearby log. "Go ahead." Harold Saturday, the wood creaking beneath him. For a moment, he said nothing, staring into the forest as though searching for something in its depths. "The pendant," he began, his voice low, "has grown restless." Lorne tensed. "What do you mean?" "The chest where I keep it," Harold explained, "has begun to hum, faintly, but it's unmistakable. I fear the seal may be weakening." Lorne's stomach turned. "But Quinn's sacrifice bought us time," Harold interrupted, his voice heavy with sorrow. "But it was not a permanent solution. The beast, the darkness, it will stir again, and when it does, it will seek vengeance for being denied." A cold silence settled between them. The forest seemed to loom larger, its shadows darker, as if it were listening. "What do we do?" Lorne asked, his voice barely audible. Harold sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his years. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we must prepare. The forest is patient, but it is not merciful. It will come for us, and we must be ready to face it." That night, Lorne sat alone in his cottage, the fire crackling weakly in the hearth. Harold's words replayed in his mind, each one carving deeper into his resolve. He stared at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of labor, and wondered if he had the strength to face the forest again. He thought of Quinn, of the fire in his eyes as he stood against the beast. Lorne had always admired Quinn's courage, but now he understood the cost of that bravery. It wasn't just the act of standing firm in the face of danger, it was the knowledge of what would be lost. As the hours dragged on, sleep refused to come. The whispers had returned, faint and teasing, just on the edge of hearing. They carried no words this time, only a melody, soft, haunting, and impossible to ignore. Unable to endure the stillness, Lorne threw on his cloak and stepped into the freezing night. The village was silent, its rooftops blanketed in snow, but the forest called to him. He followed the sound of the whispers, his boots crunching in the frost as he approached the tree line. The shadows of the forest seemed to shift as he neared, the faint melody growing louder. It was mournful and beautiful, weaving through the air like a siren's song. Lorne's heart raced as he stepped beneath the canopy, the cold air biting at his skin. The pendant was calling to him. He could feel its presence, distant but insistent, tugging at his thoughts like a thread unraveling a tapestry. He followed the pull, his steps quickening despite his better judgment. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't before. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming a twisted archway that guided him deeper into the shadows. The air grew colder, the snow crunching louder beneath his boots, until he reached the clearing where Harold's cottage stood. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Lorne's breath caught in his throat as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. The chest sat in the corner, its iron hinges gleaming faintly in the dim light. The hum was unmistakable now, a low vibration that resonated in his chest. Lorne approached the chest cautiously, his hand hovering over the latch. "Harold," he called out, but there was no answer. Taking a deep breath, he opened the chest. The pendant lay inside, its carvings glowing faintly as if alive. The hum grew louder, filling the room with a low, resonant tone that set Lorne's teeth on edge. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The moment he touched it, the world shifted. The room disappeared, replaced by darkness so absolute it felt suffocating. Lorne was weightless, suspended in an endless void. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony. "You cannot hide. You cannot run. The forest will take what it is owed." Images flashed before him, a twisted tree draped in tattered cloth, its roots stained red, a village consumed by shadow, its people screaming silently, and finally, Quinn's face, his eyes wide with fear as the beast closed in. Lorne gasped, the vision shattering as he collapsed to the floor of Harold's cottage. The pendant was still in his hand, its glow pulsating like a heartbeat. He stumbled to his feet, his mind racing. The forest wasn't waiting, it was coming, and the village was unprepared. Lorne spent the following days warning the villagers, but his pleas were met with skepticism and fear. Many dismissed him as a madman, broken by his time in the forest. Even Harold struggled to rally their trust, his age and weariness undermining his authority. But Lorne refused to give up. He worked tirelessly to prepare defenses, building barricades and teaching the villagers how to wield makeshift weapons. Every night, the whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper, until the forest felt as though it were breathing down their necks. And then, it happened. The attack came under the cover of darkness, a wave of shadows that poured from the forest like a living tide. The creatures were grotesque, their forms shifting and writhing as they surged toward the village. Their eyes burned with an unnatural light, and their howls pierced the night like jagged knives. The villagers fought bravely, their fear outweighed by their determination to protect their home. Lorne stood at the front lines, the pendant glowing fiercely in his hand as he drove the creatures back. Each pulse of its light sent the shadows reeling. But the horde was relentless. Harold stood at the center of the square, chanting an ancient incantation as he drew symbols in the snow. The air around him crackled with energy, the runes glowing faintly as he worked to strengthen the village's defenses. "Hold them off," Harold shouted, his voice strained. "I need more time." Lorne gritted his teeth, his blade slicing through a creature's shadowy form. The pendant burned in his hand, its light growing brighter with each passing moment. But the creatures were endless, their numbers overwhelming. "Harold," Lorne shouted, "we can't hold them much longer." The elder's chanting grew louder, his voice rising above the chaos. The runes flared brightly, sending a shockwave of light through the square. The creatures howled in agony, their forms disintegrating as the light consumed them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the attack ended. The shadows retreated, vanishing into the forest like a receding tide. The village was left in silence, the snow stained red with blood. Lorne collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The pendant lay in the snow beside him, its glow fading once more. Harold approached, his face pale and drawn. "It's not over," he said grimly. "This was only the beginning." Lorne looked up at him, his eyes filled with determination. "Then we'll be ready," he said, "no matter what it takes." The morning after the attack was cold and unforgiving. The village of Airwood lay in disarray, its once peaceful square marred by the scars of battle. The snow, once pristine, was churned into a crimson slush, and the barricades that had been hastily constructed now lay shattered and scattered. Villagers moved slowly through the wreckage, their faces pale and weary as they gathered the bodies of the fallen. Some whispered prayers, while others worked in heavy silence, their grief too profound for words. Lorne stood at the edge of the forest, his breath misting in the frigid air. The pendant hung heavy around his neck, its faint glow barely visible in the gray light of dawn. He had barely slept, his mind haunted by the horrors of the previous night. The shadowy creatures, the relentless whispers, the suffocating darkness, all of it had left an indelible mark on his soul. Behind him, Elder Harold approached, his steps slow and measured. The elder's face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He carried a staff now, a simple length of wood carved with runes, leaning on it as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. "They will return," Harold said quietly, his gaze fixed on the forest. "You know that, don't you?" Lorne nodded. "This was just the beginning." Harold sighed, his breath heavy in the cold. "The pendant's light won't be enough next time. The forest has awakened, and it won't stop until it takes what it wants." Lorne turned to face him, his expression hard. "Then we have to stop it, permanently." The elder studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "There may be a way," he said at last, "but it will require great sacrifice." "I'll do whatever it takes," Lorne said without hesitation. "I won't let the village fall." Harold hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. There's something you need to see." The two of them left the village quietly, slipping away while the other villagers were busy tending to the wounded and fortifying their defenses. Lorne had told no one of their departure, knowing that any attempt to explain would only invite panic. Harold had insisted on secrecy, warning that the truth of their mission was too dangerous to share. They ventured deep into the forest, following a path that seemed to appear and disappear at will, its faint traces barely discernible among the tangled roots and undergrowth. The trees grew taller and thicker as they went, their twisted branches forming an oppressive canopy that blotted out the sun. The air grew colder, heavier, and the whispers returned, soft and insistent, like the murmur of 1,000 unseen voices. Lorne clutched the pendant tightly, its faint warmth a small comfort against the chill. He could feel the forest watching him, its presence pressing down on him like a physical weight. The pendant pulsed faintly in response, as though it, too, could sense the growing tension. "Where are we going?" Lorne asked, his voice low. "To the source," Harold replied, "to the place where it all began." They walked for hours, the forest growing darker and more labyrinthine with each step. The path wound through narrow ravines and over frozen streams, its course marked by ancient symbols carved into the trees. Lorne recognized some of the markings from the cavern, their twisted designs hinting at a purpose long forgotten. Finally, they reached a clearing. At its center stood a massive tree, its trunk gnarled and blackened as though burned by some ancient fire. Its roots sprawled across the ground like the limbs of a great beast, their tips disappearing into the earth. The air around the tree was thick and still, charged with an unnatural energy that made the hairs on Lorne's arms stand on end. "This is it," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The heart of the forest." Lorne stared at the tree, his chest tightening. "What do we do?" Harold stepped forward, his staff glowing faintly as he raised it toward the tree. "This is where the darkness was first bound," he said. "Long ago, before the village was even founded. The seal here is ancient, but it's failing. If we're to stop the forest, we must renew it." "How?" Lorne asked, his voice tinged with urgency. Harold lowered his staff, his expression grave. "The seal was created with a sacrifice, a life freely given to bind the darkness. And now, it must be renewed in the same way." Lorne froze, the weight of Harold's words settling over him like a leaden cloak. "You mean, someone has to die?" Harold nodded solemnly. "Yes." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The whispers grew louder, circling the clearing like a rising wind. Lorne's gaze fell to the pendant in his hand, its faint light pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He thought of Quinn, of the sacrifice his friend had made to protect the village. And he thought of the people of Airwood, the families, the children, who would be lost if the forest consumed them. "I'll do it," Lorne said, his voice steady. Harold turned to him, his eyes widening in surprise. "Lorne, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Lorne interrupted. "Quinn gave his life to buy us time. I won't let that sacrifice be for nothing." Harold studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, but you must understand, this is no ordinary death. The seal will bind your soul to the forest. You will become part of it, forever." Lorne's jaw tightened. "I understand." The ritual began at dusk, the fading light casting long shadows across the clearing. Harold drew a circle around the tree with a mixture of ash and salt, chanting in a language that Lorne didn't recognize. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, until they formed a deafening chorus that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. Lorne stepped into the circle, the pendant hanging around his neck. Its light flared brightly, casting golden beams that cut through the darkness. He felt a strange warmth wash over him, a fleeting sense of peace amidst the chaos. Harold's chanting reached a crescendo, his voice echoing through the clearing. The runes carved into the tree began to glow, their lines pulsating with a fiery light. The ground beneath Lorne's feet trembled, and the whispers rose to a fever pitch. "Are you ready?" Harold asked, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. Lorne nodded, his expression resolute. "Do it." Harold raised his staff, the runes along its length flaring brightly. A beam of light shot from the staff to the pendant, connecting them in a blinding arc. Lorne felt a searing pain in his chest, as though his very soul were being pulled from his body. He cried out, the sound swallowed by the roar of the forest. The light grew brighter, engulfing the clearing in a blinding glow. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, it was over. When the light faded, the clearing was still. The tree stood unchanged, its roots once again silent and still. Harold lowered his staff, his body trembling with exhaustion. Lorne was gone. The pendant lay at the base of the tree, its light extinguished. Harold knelt beside it, his hand trembling as he picked it up. He closed his eyes, murmuring a quiet prayer for the man who had given everything to protect the village. As he rose to his feet, he felt a faint breeze rustle through the clearing. It carried with it the soft, familiar sound of Lorne's voice, whispering from the depths of the forest. "Take care of them." Harold nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I will." He turned and began the long journey back to Airwood. the pendant held tightly in his hand. The forest was quiet now, its shadows retreating, its whispers silenced. For the first time in years, it felt at peace, and though the villagers would never know the full extent of what had been sacrificed, they would sleep soundly, unaware of the guardian who now watched over them from the heart of the forest.